Look, there it is, right across the wadi there. God, it's just massive. Much bigger than I thought it was going to be. Really impressive. We're really out in the sticks here. You've got this massive fortification. It sort of reminds one of the French Foreign Legion fortresses.
Even half buried by sand, the scale here is formidable. The fort's gateways are heavily defended, and the 5-meter thick walls are studded with large projecting towers.
For an archaeologist interested in military fortifications, you can't get much better than this.
Within these huge ruins, there are only tiny clues to the lives of the soldiers stationed here.
There's a lot of ostrich eggshell beads here. Whether the soldiers like to dress themselves up in beads, or whether it was the travellers passing through, or whether the soldiers lived here with their families, we just don't know. This would not be one of the best postings, I wouldn't have thought, in the Kushite army. It must have been an absolute desperate place to be.
A far worse posting was to the front line of a war with Assyria. When Assyria attacked Egypt, Taharqa couldn't hold the line, and in a defeat that neither he nor Kush would recover from, Taharqa was driven out of Lower Egypt. Taharqa died in 664 BC, but not before building himself a magnificent pyramid across the river from Jebel Barkal.
It's always taken as a reflection of the power and the wealth of a pharaoh, the size of his pyramid, and if that equation is actually correct, then obviously Taharqa had a very high opinion of himself. Originally he built a pyramid 28.5 meters square out of white limestone, but because he lived to such a ripe old age and had a different perception of his own value, he decided to make his pyramid even bigger. So once the pyramid was completely finished, he then had his workmen encase it in a massive pyramid, the largest that a Kushite ruler ever built.
When Taharqa's nephew, Tanwetamani, became pharaoh, he described a vision in which the goddesses handed him Egypt's crown. In his first year as pharaoh, Tanwetamani defeated the Assyrians, but the dream couldn't hold. The following year, the Assyrians returned and drove Kush out of Egypt for good. Tanwetamani's burial chamber gives us a final glimpse of the glory of the Kushite Black Pharaohs.
Here we see the king being escorted into his tomb by two gods. And the representation of the king is really quite fantastic. It's one of the two surviving paintings of a Kushite king that we have. And here we see all the classic Kushite royal regalia. The so-called cap crown with a double cobras or urei over his brow, which symbolized his rule of Egypt and Kush. And on the other wall is the king being escorted out of the tomb, and according to the Book of the Dead, assume any form of existence which pleased him. This was an eternal cycle. The king was supposed to live this way forever.
When Reisner excavated the burial chamber, he found it completely empty, long plundered of all the treasures Tanwetamani would have brought home from Egypt.
The tomb is interesting because it's a classic example of a royal tomb of that day, and you can see that it's a miniature universe. Overhead is a starry sky, and the walls are inscribed with texts from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Unfortunately, the paintings are damaged. When we go over to the tomb of Tanwetamani's mother, we find an almost identical tomb where the paintings are very well preserved. Over here, she's shown as though she were just buried, lying in her bandaged mummy case. And on this side, we have the queen sort of rolling over and reviving because this god is holding to her nose this sign of life. And underneath, you can see a collection of gold objects, the kind of things that would have filled the tomb: scepters, bows, crowns. These two tombs are really masterpieces of Kushite art. They're the best preserved we have in the Sudan.
Tanwetamani was the last Kushite black pharaoh. Nevertheless, Kush retained its adopted Egyptian customs. Amun remained its state god, and Kushite kings and queens continued to be buried under pyramids for another 1,000 years. Sudan has some 300 pyramids, 3 times as many as were built in Egypt. And Kush continued to be a thorn in Egypt's side. Its kings still aspired to be black pharaohs. Until 594 BC, when Egypt's pharaoh, Psammetichus II, decided to crush their ambitions for good. In one symbolic act of destruction, he gave Charles Bonnet the discovery of his lifetime.
Exciting, surely. I didn't sleep for 2 days. We found in this pit 50 fragments of 7 marvelous statues of king. Psammetichus II broke the statue of the king ancestor because they were afraid of these kings. And he put the pieces of statue in a pit. For us, it is an historical discovery, very important.
Psammetichus trashed the temples, burned the royal palace, came here to just put an end to this cult once and for all, to say, okay boys, the game's up, you're out of it.
The move of the royal capital to Merowe marks the final stage of the Kushites' long journey, and of ours too. At Merowe, the wheel turned full circle. Kush and Egypt once again became trading partners, and Kush remained a player on the world stage, well known to the Greeks and Romans.
It's interesting just to think at the time that the city of Rome was founded, Kush was a major world power, and Kush was still a major power in the 4th century AD at the time of the decline of the Roman Empire. So it spans a vast range of time and was an important state for a very considerable period.
Merowe's magnificent royal cemetery is the end of our journey. These pyramids belong to all the Kushite kings and queens from the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD.
Just down the hill here are the latest royal tombs of the Kushite dynasty, over 1,000 years after the time of Pianki and Taharqa. Sudan has been totally eclipsed by Egypt. People think that Abu Simbel is the absolute limit of civilization up the Nile, but here there's untold riches. Sudan is what I do, and will be till the end of my days.
Merowe's pyramids are a lasting testimony to the glory of Kush, the land of the black pharaohs that history forgot.
Next week, Women of the Gold Rush tells the story of 3 adventurous Irish women who risked everything for life in America's frontier. 9:30 next Thursday night. Coming up, late edition news, then live from Abbey Road.